AndyHouse would like to introduce the story Cold Wind on the Wild Mound, based on the true story in the Western region, South Vietnam. Chapter 3: The Terrible Scream in the Night. Since then, there have been two similar cases like Ms. Than's husband. Both unintentionally and deliberately, these men used to go alone to the mound. But absolutely no one has died there. They were in a state of dying and were cured by the villagers. The wind swept through the trees, rustling with coldness of the night. Suddenly Mr. Muoi felt a chill along his spine, not knowing whether it was because of the wind or because of the old story. The image of Mr. Then at noon kept clinging to his mind. The next day, he walked out to visit the field. The field of young and immature plaited is wide and cool, promise a good harvest. Mr. Muoi took a deep breath and sat down on the bank of the dike. Suddenly, he saw a distant shadow of an old man with garlic hair and a long beard hanging on the side of the field. Mr. Muoi raised his body and shouted,
"Mr. Nam, come here and smoke."
The old man raised his head to squint his eyes, then laughed. His voice was bright.
"Is that Muoi? Why did you visit the field so early?"
Mr. Nam was in his 70s, but he looked a bit brighter in his eyes. He was wearing a three-piece bra, revealing a solid chest, with Nam tattooed on his chest in a Chinese ink. Striding quickly on the dike, popping a cigarette, he let out a laugh.
"This year, you get that season. Well, yesterday I heard Mr. Then got sick, and his wife brought him to you, right?" "That's right, sir." "What's wrong with him? Healthy yet? He looks so good." "I let her take the medicine ladder to use. It's fine." "Well, I heard some neighbors say that he was shocked by Mrs. Chin. Badly."
Mr. Nam shouted, making him jump up.
"What's ghost? I'm here from the past until now, but I don't see anything. It's all scandalous. I heard many people met."
Mr. Muoi asked. He wanted to know more about the ancient story. Those who know the old story no longer exist. He hoped Mr. Nam would know more than what he was told. But he was quickly disappointed. Mr. Nam hurriedly stood up and left after releasing a light sentence.
"I don't believe in ghosts. When I meet, I believe."
Then he left Mr. Muoi with questions in his heart. How did the girl die? And then Mrs. Chin? Mr. Muoi felt something strange about Mr. Nam's treatment. He probably only knew this story well. The answer Muoi had not found. There were horrible things that happened right after that afternoon. At the evening of the 14th new moon, it rose up behind the bamboo bank. The lunar moonlight had a dreamy look in the gentle light of the quiet village. There was no one out of the house at this hour, and there were only barking dogs in the night. Mr. Nam wandered home after the drinking party in the hamlet. He drank quite a lot, so he saw his footsteps stunned. Since his wife died, he was often drunk. Because of his lonely life, and because in this age, he often remembers old stories, he needed alcohol to put him to sleep. He hiccuped. His footsteps stopped suddenly. In front of him faintly appeared a thin, opaque smoke. Mr. Nam tried to raise his hand to rub his eyes. Maybe the alcohol made his old eyes not look well? His hand suddenly became cold. The chill ran down his spine, causing him to feel numb. Somehow he is standing in front of the most frightening place in this area, Mrs. Chin Mound. He blurted out. Since returning to this village, he has never been to this place. For him, everything had been buried since he left the place more than 20 years ago. Now, he was a silver-haired old man, whose past haunted him. In front of him, behind a thin, cold mist like from the ground, the black mountain reminded him of old stories. From that day, he has never had a good night's sleep. Just close his eyes. He heard a cry, and especially those eyes kept clinging to him. Sometimes dreaming to fall asleep, he was startled by the screams of resentment in the night. His legs were trembling. His hands were raised to hold his face. He did not dare to look at that girl's face. The white face full of fresh blood. Big eyes, streaks of blood staring at him every night for many years. In the dream, he tried to running away, but his ears were thick with screams. When exhausted, he raised his hand to wipe the sweat flowing from his face. Suddenly he was disgusted because of the smell of fresh blood. Looking back, he was horrified to realize that his hands were bloody. Panic. He woke up awake, sweating like a shower. He left the country to believe that life would be more peaceful. But no. Until now, after years of wandering the country, nearing the land far from heaven, he still has not left the past sin. And in the face of this place, he knew he couldn't hide anymore. His hands were still in his face. He exclaimed,
"Please stop following me. The old story was because you took it yourself. I didn't want you to die like that. Because of you."
A shriek sounding like the sound of two clenched human teeth. Suddenly Mr. Nam winced, glaring at the mound, his eyes protruding. His blood seemed to stop flowing in his veins because he was horrified. On the dark mound, a figure appeared, hovering in the dew mist that turned red, like blood. He moaned and smelled the blood that he smelled in his dream. He looked back, his hands full of blood. Blood dripped onto the shirt he was wearing. He tried to run, but his feet were buried in the ground. This was the last nightmare of his life. At the same time, he looked so close to that face that was now close. He felt the coldness of the pale white skin covered with blood. The eyes were wide open, revealing hatred. It was the eyes he had not dared to look at that afternoon. Leaving her lying on the cold mound, he saw clearly the traces of his nails scratching the skin of the girl, drawing on every bloody red mark. The ragged girl's clothes in his drunken madness. At that time he was no different from a drunken beast. When she fainted, he released her. He shivered. Each girl's fingers touched his cold bone. The fingers with no nail were full of mud, as she tried to pin down the mound to fight. The tangle of long black hair brushed his face. In the girl's throat rang out sobs, half moaning, half like a choking. Her tight mouth slowly opened with blood. Mr. Nam howled. On his hand, half of her tongue was hot and red. The girl, in the extreme humiliation at that time, gathered all her strength to bite of her tongue. The blood of the corners of her mouth saturated on the ground. She died, but her eyes were wide open as she watched him. He hurriedly resisted the canoe. Those eyes are now looking at him with terrible hatred. The last moment his life realized, causing blood debt. He had to pay with blood. The long screams tore through the night, extending the immense space. Screams screeching, waking everyone up. Whole Mr. Muoi's family woke up. The sound of dogs barking made the night more dreadful. He opened the door slightly, looked out. What caused that terrible sound? The scream like a plaintive cry's bitterl. In the field far away, everything was engulfed in moonlight. The moon was bright red like blood.